All right, thank you. You guys want to get Callan back in so we don't have to wait for that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Every rise from here. Okay, we'd be seated. Mr. County, come on back up. You are still under oath. Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Cowing, behind you, I have up People's Exhibit 340. You discussed a little bit the leather couch. And may I have permission to approach?
You may.
I know this gets a little confusing because 340 is how the living room appeared on March 29th, 2012, right? Is that actually March, November, 29th, 2012? And it looks different in August of 2013 when you were there. But the point, and what was discussed a bit on direct, is that it was this couch, the one that's against the north wall, that was moved. You got in there by August 2015, right?
Yes.
And it moved this wall here where the television was, right?
Correct.
And you were either present to observe or Ms. Corcoran told you that the dog alerted to a blue line from the couch to the left wall.
Correct.
So then the other locations in the room where there was blood that was positive in the lab, the dog didn't alert to any of those locations, right?
Correct.
It would be okay to take that down if you please, counsel, or leave it, either's fine. By March of 2013, you were making no secret of the fact that Mr. Redwine was a suspect, the suspect. Is that fair?
Yes.
And in March of 2013, you were telling him you would have him prosecuted, right?
Yes.
Not relevant and it's beyond scope.
Mr. Moran.
Your Honor, the relevance here is just to inform why a citizen might have been reluctant to converse with this law enforcement official who's telling him that he'll be prosecuted and that he was a suspect. It goes to...
I agree. I think you're good.
In the same vein, and I'm not suggesting this was you or law enforcement, but you did become aware that Mr. Redwine was getting death threats, right?
Yes.
And he, at one point, you in fact called one individual to tell him to knock it off.
Correct.
And that was somebody who was posting online about his fantasies of killing Mr. Redwine.
Correct.
there was discussion on direct about that. Pardon me if I've messed up the date, but I believe it was June 27th, and that was the day that you personally broke the news to Mr. Redwine that his child's remains had been positively identified. Is that right?
Yes.
And you described that he had an emotional reaction.
Yes.
I believe the word that you chose was that he was weeping.
Yes.
Is sobbing too strong for what you observed?
No.
So suffice to say, strong emotional reaction for the father of this child when you broke the news to him about his son being definitively deceased.
Yes.
When Mr. Redwine was called and he said that he was in Indianapolis and you were telling him that items had been found, there was some discussion on direct examination about his response to you suggesting that items had been found, right?
Yes.
And he referred to them both as items, and then he named particular items. Is that right? Shoes, clothing.
He referred to them as articles, and yes, clothing and a shoe.
Thank you for that correction. I recall now as articles. Around the time searching is going on again in June of 2013, there was a vigil, held. Is that right?
Correct.
And then after that vigil, you became aware of people gathering at the Billy Goat Saloon. They were planning to do harm to Mr. Redwine.
Objection, and any more questions after this, it goes beyond the scope.
Any more questions after this on that issue? I think it goes beyond the scope, and this will be the second, maybe the third time, but at least the second time we've established this. And so after this, I want you to be done with it. Okay.
So you were aware that a crowd had gathered and was threatening harm to Mr. Redwine?
Yes.
On February 5th, 2014, you participated in the seizure of Mr. Redwine's pickup truck, right?
Correct.
You called Mr. Redwine about it, and he agreed to bring it to you. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'm sorry, this is a little bit of an aside. I wanted to clear something up we talked about before lunch. You mentioned the 41-1, wherein Mr. Redwine needed to come in to, or you were allowed then to take pictures of him, his body, his hands, right?
Correct.
And you called him to inform him of that 41-1. He agreed to come and meet with you.
He did.
So you didn't have to chase him down and do anything like that, right?
Yes.
And the same on this February 14th date, when you called him, he was in Farmington. Is that right?
February 14th.
I'm sorry, February of 2014, February 5th, 2014, and you seized the Dodge.
Correct.
And you knew that he was in Farmington because Investigator Gabbard and Investigator Patterson had set up surveillance on the pickup truck, right?
Correct.
The Florida County Sheriff's Office personnel were assisted by New Mexico law enforcement agents from San Juan County Sheriff's Office in watching that truck as it was being brought to you.
Objection of relevance and beyond the scope.
Mr. Moran?
Seizure of this truck was discussed by the prosecution in direct, and I just want to establish Mr. Redwine's cooperation because his unwillingness to participate in the efforts to find his son has been raised over and over by the prosecution. There's evidence to rebut that.
Well, I don't understand why people were watching the truck has anything to do with that. so I'm going to sustain the objection.
On that occasion, when Mr. Redwine provided you the Dodge pickup truck, he did express some frustration because he said he needed to use the truck to get to Texarkana for work.
Objection of relevance.
That one I can see some relevance to.
Is that right?
Yes.
And you were aware that he had driven that truck from Texarkana, Arkansas, before you seized it, right?
Yes.
Was it at that time that the GPS unit had been installed on that truck?
In reference to which date?
February 2014. February 2014.
And repeat that question again.
Let me ask it this way. Did you install a GPS tracking monitor on Mr. Redwine's truck?
I don't recall doing that, no.
You were aware that it had been done?
I don't recall.
On June 22nd, 2013, that's when you were on Middle Mountain participating in a search, right?
Yes.
And you discussed that search on direct examination, agree?
Yes.
And on that day, you there was a bone that you found, is that right?
As a group, we found items, yes.
There's one specifically I'm talking about where the two cadaver dogs that you were with indicated the smell of
Objection, Your Honor.
No.
Relevance. Oh,
This search was inquired after on
Come here.
direct examination. Your Honor, I think I'll leave it there.
All right.
Nothing further.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. So, Investigator Cowan, you were asked about if a report from a different investigator, Mr. Patterson, refreshed your memory about phone service. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
With regard to that, do you actually yourself, from the investigation, have knowledge about where Verizon works and where it doesn't?
Yes.
Okay. So two things were referenced, I believe. In the recording, it was specific to Middle Mountain, not the house. Am I accurate?
Yes.
And then also, counsel asked you about the house.
Correct.
Can you tell what your experience is in terms of Verizon service at the house?
My experience as a whole, Verizon works better in that area at that time, and especially at that house.
Is it fair to say that all phone coverage is spotty and Biacedo when we get up in the Middle Mountain area, things like that?
Yes.
Have you witnessed one of your fellow investigators be able to use her Verizon phone at the residence?
Yes.
And then when we're talking about Middle Mountain Road itself, in that recording, were you saying that Verizon works better or AT&T from where you placed the call?
Verizon.
Thank you. I'm going to approach the 507, Your Honor. This is just a map of a search area that I forgot to introduce. It did come up and cross the area itself. That's acceptable to the court.
That's fine.
Basically just laying this as a foundation investigator, but you testified about the search on August 6th and where Karen Corcoran's dog went on that search.
Yes,
Is 507 fair and accurate to that?
it is.
And I move to admit 507 in the evidence, Your Honor.
I might just ordeal on it briefly.
Go ahead.
My impression from your testimony was that Ms. Corcoran was just pointed at the trailhead. Is that, did I misunderstand that?
We had her start from the parking area, and she worked, well, yes, she worked down towards the slope.
Basically what I'm getting at is you weren't with them for the entirety of her dog sniffing search of this recovery area, were you?
No, not the whole time.
Or did you have eyes on the dog sufficient that you can say that this is a fair and accurate representation of where the dog went, or is this just sort of roughly as you understood it through things people were telling you?
I had eyes on initially seeing them go in that direction, and that's about it.
I'm not certain how far it extends or whether this purple blob in the middle is a fair and accurate representation of what was searched.
Correct.
Judge, on that basis, we'll object.
Okay. Any response at all?
Just that judge is being offered for the general area, and it's not being proposed as precise. The jury has 520 for GPS coordinates as well.
You know, I'm going to deny so not coming.
I want to talk to you about the iPhone. You remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Okay. And counsel asked you if, in your life experience, if phones can be broken and then set out to dry. You remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Did the defendant say he had set his phone out to dry and it was fixed when you talked to him on June 21st?
No.
What did he actually say about it?
He volunteered a statement that the phone is working again.
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the first time you talked to him. So let me give you the exact date. June 21st of 2013, when you reached him and he said that he hadn't called you back because the phone had fallen in the sink. Remember that?
Yes.
Did he say if he'd done anything after the phone fell in the sink?
He said he replaced the phone.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about the entry video. You recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
You did have something to do a camera video that day, right?
Yes.
What was the purpose of the entry video?
To show, upon entry, that the condition of the house prior to working the dogs in the house, and the condition of the house as we left it. Basically showing that everything is left in its place.
Was that in part based on the defendant's request that you can go in as long as you read everything how you found it?
Yes.
Okay. And then in terms of video, whether it was Officer Corcoran or not on video, did you follow her and Molly around the house everywhere they went during the search?
No.
So you had testified, I think, that you were on the threshold area of the door, right?
Yes.
Did you have any opportunity to follow her with a camera without interfering?
No.
And then I'd like to ask you about the comment, defense counsel said that you make a specific statement about blood and brains on boots. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And I believe what counsel asked you was, you said something to the effect of, you've stepped in lots of blood and brain. You recall that?
Yes.
Do you know what statement he's referring to?
I do.
When was that statement made?
That was made on June 29th, 2013.
Is that the entire sentence that you said, or just part of the sentence that you said?
Just part.
Do you recall the exact words and sentence that you said on that occasion? And if not, of course, I could refresh your memory.
It would be good to refresh my memory.
Judge, may I approach with page 74 out of 77? related to that transcript referenced by defendant?
Yes. Did I give you enough information, Mr. Pratt?
I don't think at all.
Okay.
I'll draw your attention to the sentence that you were asked about, and then I'll draw your attention to the rest of that sentence in the following. So the questions by counsel were related to whether you could have tracked any odor in the house, right?
Yes.
What was the full sentence that you said?
I had discussed with Mark how I have worked other crime scenes. And have come in contact with human biological fluids.
Okay. The sentence itself, do you remember what you said, or do you need the transcript?
Probably needed.
Okay. May I approach one more time, Your Honor?
Yes.
So
This
just
one
so,
is asked and answered.
just so that
Hold on. No, it hasn't been answered.
Not the way he wants, but it's been answered. This is impeachment now.
I think it's appropriate. Go ahead and you can approach.
so as you refresh your memory, what I'm asking you is specifically, what was the entire sentence in the next sentence so the jury has the context of the comment about whether you stepped in lots of blood and brain, okay?
Okay.
So keep that in mind as you refresh. Please tell the jury what you said.
Yes. I stated we've worked a lot of crime scenes and I've thrown away a lot of boots.
And in that same sentence that you said you'd thrown away a lot of boots and stepped in lots of blood and brain.
Correct.
Objection, asked and answered, improper impeachment.
You know what? It's in. Let's move on.
What do you actually do with boots when you step in things on a crime scene?
I throw them away, and if they're not too bad, I turn them into autopsy shoes.
Do you go walking around crime scenes in the boots that you've walked in other crime scenes in?
No.
And this statement was actually started about the fact that you throw those boots away.
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions, Judge.
Anything from the jury? Counsel, want to come up? Yeah, thank you. Okay, Lieutenant Cowling, where were you when you placed the call to Mr. Redwine to ask when he planned to return?
I was 6 miles up on Middle Mountain Road at the gravel pit.
Okay. Any follow-up from your side on that?
Just one question, Judge. Was that close to the remain site?
Yes.
But you had to go up to the gravel pit, though, huh?
That's where we typically base out of.
Right, because there's a cell signal there, right? In part.
Yes.
And when you're down at the remain site and in the ravine and in that area, cell service is not as good. Fair?
It works for Verizon, yes.
But not for both companies and not as you move about in that area. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Okay, can this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
You're free to go. Next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, people call Dr. Robert Kurtzman to the stand.
All right. Come on up to the witness stand up here, please, sir. please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, I do. Thank you. Have a seat. Thank you.
Thank you. May I inquire, Your Honor?
You may.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
I'm good, and yourself?
Doing well, thanks. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your last name for the record?
My name is Dr. Robert A. Kurtzman. That's Kurtzman.
Dr. Kurtzman, how are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed as the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Montana as a forensic pathologist.
What do those duties include as the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Montana?
So for the state of Montana, we work with 56 different county coroners. We have 2 regional medical examiners' offices, one in Billings and one in Missoula. Our system is set up so that the medical examiner's office is also incorporated within the forensic science division, which includes the latent prints, DNA, serology, tool mark, firearms, chemistry, and toxicology sections, as well as the medical examiner section. We have a total of 4 forensic pathologists, including myself, and one of our pathologists is also a PhD anthropologist. My job is to supervise the medical examiner portion of the forensic science division.
And as part of that, do you also supervise the other forensic pathologists within the office?
Yes, I do. And so in that capacity, what happens is we have a daily conference to review all of our cases that come into the office that are referred from the coroners throughout the state. And we handle about 750 cases each year. And then there may be cases where coroners will call on us for consultation but not require a post-mortem examination.
When you say 750 cases, are you referring to 750 autopsies?
Correct. So mostly autopsies. Some of those cases are external examinations, and some of them may be a partial autopsy.
I'm going to be asking the court to have you qualified as an expert in forensic pathology. In order to do that, I need to go through your educational and career background, okay?
Certainly.
You tell the jury about your educational experience.
Sure. I received my undergraduate degree in biology from Quinnipiac, well, it was Quinnipiac College at the time. It's now Quinnipiac University. I attended Quinnipiac between 1973 and 1977. Then I went on to the College of Osteopathic Medicine and Surgery in Des Moines, Iowa. I graduated with a Doctor of Osteopathy degree in 1980. After I completed my medical school training, I then served a 1-year rotating internship at Cranston General Hospital, which is located in Cranston, Rhode Island. A rotating internship is an internship for a year spent rotating through various areas of specialization in medicine. So that would include family practice, pediatrics, surgery, ear, nose, and throat. Basically, it's a broad exposure to different areas in medicine.
Doctor, I'm sorry, can you explain to the jury what osteopathic medicine is?
Sure. So osteopathic medicine is one of 2 mainstreams of traditional medicine that's practiced in the United States, where the practitioners have a full scope of practice. Most people are familiar with MDs. That would be considered allopathic medicine. Osteopathic medicine had its beginnings or origins in the 1860s, and there's an emphasis on musculoskeletal aspects in osteopathic medicine. And in some ways, at least in our education, we're encouraged to have a more holistic approach to the treatment of medical issues that a patient might present with.
Thank you. So if you could continue walking us through your educational and career experience.
Sure. So after my internship, I spent a year and 4 months in general practice in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The reason for that was my stepfather had passed away. He had a practice in that area from 1950 to 1980 when he passed away from a brain tumor. I was just going back to keep the office open until my mother was able to sell the office. At the conclusion of keeping the office going, I then started a pathology residency, and that is a study of disease and how it affects the body. So that's what pathology is. And pathology in general includes various aspects of what's considered anatomical pathology. And so it's studying the diseases and disorders that you might see with all different parts of the body. So that's skin, bone, heart, lungs, kidneys, spleen, pancreas, intestines. You look at all different aspects of the body and you become familiar with the diseases that affect those different portions of the body. And of course, trauma would be considered a disease aspect as well.
Did you then have an opportunity to work in neuropathology?
So as a part of my pathology training, there were certain areas where I received some additional training. Neuropathology in particular was spent at the Henry Ford Hospital in Michigan, and in Detroit, Michigan. And I spent about 4 months working with a neuropathologist there by the name of Jacob Chasen. And also during my pathology residency, I received some special training in dermatopathology at the University of Michigan, virology at Children's Hospital in Detroit. I spent some forensic pathology rotations and toxicology rotations at the Office of the Medical Examiner's Office in Detroit. And I also I took a specialized course in orthopedic pathology or bone pathology at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Bethesda, Maryland. And that was a course specifically designed to look at all aspects of bone pathology, bone growth, physiology, embryology, infectious diseases, trauma, neoplastic disorders. So it was a kind of a broad representation of bone pathology, if you will.
Dr. Kurtzman, if I can interrupt, I'm sorry. You mentioned your work as in forensic pathology at the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office. What was significant about that experience?
So that experience, I spent, during my residency in pathology, you're exposed to subspecialty areas. So that was my first exposure to forensic pathology. And I spent 2 months rotating at the medical examiner's office in Detroit. At that time, it was a office that employed 6 full-time staff pathologists and then 2 fellows. And the office handled about 3,500 to 4,000 cases per year, including about 800 to 900 homicides per year. And so that was my first exposure to the medical examiner's office. Later on, after I finished my pathology residency, I went back there for a year of dedicated specialty training or forensic training, or excuse me, fellowship training in forensic pathology at the medical examiner's office, and that was between 1987 and 1988.
Thank you, Doctor. Can you tell us about your current licensing and board certifications, please, or any that were recently retired?
Sure. So I'm currently licensed to practice in Montana and in Colorado. My initial license was in Pennsylvania, and a second license I had was in Michigan. However, I've recently retired those licenses because I don't plan on heading back that way.
And what positions have you held here in the state of Colorado during the course of your career, Dr. Kurtzman?
So I came to Colorado in 1992 from the Detroit area. And at that time I was residing in Mesa County, and I was performing postmortem examinations for the Mesa County coroner. And then that later expanded to include other counties in Colorado. So in northwestern Colorado, that included Moffett, Rio Blanco, Garfield, Eagle, Pitkin, and Mesa County. On rare occasions, I would do cases that were sent up from Delta and or Montrose. And then I also did autopsies on a pretty regular basis in southwestern Colorado from 2012, 2013 up until about 2015. And that included La Plata County, Archuleta, San Juan, Dolores, and let's see, basically 5 counties in southwestern. And then on occasion, I would go over to Boulder and Adams County as well.
Also serve as a forensic pathologist there, or serve in that capacity?
To serve in that capacity. So coroners in the state of Colorado would request postmortem examinations, and those examinations have to be performed by a pathologist, a forensic pathologist.
You've obviously had a long career, but if you could just briefly discuss your work experience outside the great state of Colorado, some of the positions you've held in other states.
In Michigan, before I came to Colorado, in addition to working with the Office of Medical Examiner in Wayne County, I worked with Oakland County, Tuscola, Sanilac, Monroe, Macomb. I also did postmortem examinations for the Wayne State University Bioengineering Department. They had a program where cadavers were subjected to various types of trauma in a very controlled and documented setting. And so my purpose was to perform the postmortem examination, document whatever injuries were present, and then that information was utilized by the bioengineering staff. And so they were the principal investigators in those cases. And then here in Colorado, just the counties which I've already discussed. And then in Montana, mostly the same thing, although we work with the entire state, so that's 56 different counties.
Can you please tell the jury about some of the faculty appointments you've held during the course of your career?
So when I was a fellow at the medical examiner's office in Detroit, typically we were on staff in the office, and we received students from Wayne State University. And so it wasn't a formal position per se, but it was a clinical instructor position. And so I've done the same thing for, it's been years ago now, Michigan State University, the osteopathic school there, or the osteopathic school in Pomona, and at Mesa State University, well, not Mesa State, it's Colorado Mesa University now. I was a volunteer instructor, probably between, I guess, about 2013 and maybe 2015. I don't recall exactly the dates there, but I was doing some examinations at the Forensic Investigation Research Station there. And so we would have students that would come through and they would observe autopsies. And then the only recent clinical instructor position that I have is just recently, within the last couple of months, is with the University of North Dakota School of Medicine.
What professional memberships do you hold, Doctor?
I'm a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the Montana Medical Association, the American Society for Clinical Pathology, and the College of American Pathologists.
And any offices or positions you've held over the years relevant to this case?
Not specifically. I've served in different capacities. In hospital settings, I've served as chief of staff, board member for different locations. The American Osteopathic College of Pathology, which actually I forgot to mention, I'm a member of that. I had a board position and a leadership position there. I'd say pretty much about it.
Have you had the opportunity, Dr. Kurtzman, to work on child fatality teams or disaster recovery teams?
Yes, I have on a number of occasions. With regard to mass disaster in 1987, in August, there was a DC-9 that crashed on takeoff at the Detroit airport, and there were 156 fatalities that were experienced at that time. And at the medical examiner's office, we established a temporary morgue location at the airport, and we processed the remains of the deceased to provide identity for those who perished in that crash. And then in terms of child fatality review teams, that's something that I was a member of in Colorado, and I'm a member of in the state of Montana as well. And in child fatality review teams, basically we're looking at any type of fatality that's associated with an individual under the age of 18.
How about presentations you've given during the course of your career? If you could just touch on a few of those for the court, please.
Sure. Many presentations. Many of the presentations that I've done were at the American Osteopathic Association. Some of them have been provided to law enforcement. Some of them have been provided to local forensic groups or death investigation groups. At the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, I provide education with the basic and advanced coroner training in Montana. I've presented education to a variety of law-related groups, prosecuting and defense attorneys or combinations thereof. And I can't think of anything else that's more specific at the moment.
How about publications?
Publication, I've just got a couple of publications. One from years ago, which related to a death that occurred in the mountains associated with a lightning strike, and a more recent publication just a few years ago dealing with high-altitude death investigation. And so that touched on high-altitude illness, so high-altitude pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, and also some of the factors that one might see in terms of a differential diagnosis that include injury or hypothermia, lightning strikes, things of that sort.
In the course of your career, have you been previously qualified as an expert in forensic pathology?
Yes, I have, many times.
On approximately how many occasions, Dr. Kurtzman?
It's been hundreds, although I've never really kept track.
And at least some of those have been here in the state of Colorado as well?
Yes, mostly in Mesa County, Garfield, Eagle, Pitkin, that area.
Your Honor, at this time, the people have moved to have Dr. Kurtzman qualified as an expert in forensic pathology.
Mr. Bogan?
No objection.
He'll be qualified as an expert in forensic pathology.
Dr. Kurtzman, what does a forensic pathologist do on a day-to-day basis?
So, forensic pathologist is a pathologist that specializes in forensic pathology. So it's a subspecialty of pathology. Pathology is the study of disease and how it affects the body. And with forensic pathology, that information is used to determine the cause of death and the manner of death in individuals who died suddenly, unexpectedly, or in a violent setting. And one of the key aspects of forensic pathology is the interpretation of patterns and distribution of injuries that are sustained to various parts of the body. The reason being is that the pattern and distribution of the injury is indicative of the mechanism by which the injury has been sustained. So, as an example, say if a person sustains a gunshot wound, you need to be able to determine, is it a gunshot wound entrance or is it an exit? If it is a gunshot wound that has evidence of a close range of fire, so you look at those characteristics. If an individual sustains injuries in a motor vehicle collision, is there a pattern that suggests that that individual might be the driver of the motor vehicle or perhaps another occupant? And so we look very closely at injury patterns, and again, we look at the disease process, and when we are called upon to examine cases, it's to determine the cause of death, which is what brings about the individual's demise, and then the manner of death. The manner is how that cause is brought about. So an example of a cause of death might be a heart attack. If a person has a heart attack and dies and there's no other extenuating circumstances, generally that would be considered a natural disease process. If a person is engaged in some type of activity that ordinarily would not be expected to result in that person's demise, so let's say you're walking down the street and you trip and fall off of the curb, hit your head and sustain a blunt force head injury, that could be fatal. That would be considered an accident. If somebody does something to themselves knowingly to take their own life, that would be considered a suicide. If somebody does something to someone else with a, how should I say, a specific purpose, that would be considered a homicide. Homicide shouldn't be construed with murder. Murder is a process that is determined through the adjudication process. So when I say homicide, it just means that somebody has done something that has caused another person's death, and it's done with some deliberateness. deliberateness. Excuse me.
Generally speaking, how does a forensic pathologist become involved in a case that might become a criminal prosecution?
So there's two ways generally in the United States. Medical examiners or forensic pathologists oftentimes work in medical examiner offices, and in that case we work with investigators, and the investigators are notified by either law enforcement or by dispatch that there's a death, and the investigator will respond to the scene and collect information. If it's determined that a postmortem examination is necessary, then that case would be brought into the office. In the case of a coroner system, what happens is that the coroner acts essentially as the investigator. And so the same thing happens, it's just that the coroner is the one that collects the information. In coroner states or in coroner jurisdictions, the coroner has the statutory authority as it relates to the death, but they have to have a pathologist perform that examination if it requires an autopsy. And not all cases require an autopsy.
And I was struck by something you just said. You said collecting the information or gathering the information. So is there information you look at to determine cause and manner of death besides conducting the autopsy or the review of the remains?
Sure, absolutely. Whenever we look at a case, it's important to collect information that may be available, but it's also important to try to treat that information as just a piece of information that's been provided by someone else. And what I mean by that is that when we actually do our autopsy or postmortem examination, what we're doing is we're either going to corroborate or we may not corroborate what has been reported. And so if a piece of information is provided with regard to the person's health status, that becomes important. If the piece of information is provided about activities that they might have been engaged in prior to their death, that becomes important. And we try to look at all that information, and then you look at the case, and then through your evaluation, determine if it's consistent or not, and then you would render an opinion based on the findings in your examination.
So fair to say you look at all that information in determining what cause and manner of death is your expert opinion.
That's correct.
Turning to this case, Doctor, were you first contacted about this case in September of 2013?
I was.
And did you, along with Dr. Dawn Mulhern and the coroner, Jan Smith, take a look at some postcranial remains that had been recovered?
So that came a little bit later. I can provide my recollection.
While you're here, sure.
So the first contact that I had was from the coroner, Jan Smith, who I had worked with for a number of years. And she had indicated to me that the remains of individual, possibly Dylan Redwine, had been recovered, and that those remains were taken into custody by the Plata County Sheriff's Office. And they were identified as human remains by Dr. Dawn Mulhern. And I didn't see any of the remains. I wasn't involved in the case at that point in time. My understanding was that Jan did not have custody of those remains. Typically what would have happened if she had custody of those remains is she would have called me and said, hey, I've got a case for you.
Can I stop you for 1 second? Sure. Just so the jury's aware, Dr. Mulhern, to your knowledge, is a forensic anthropologist.
Dr. Mulhern, I know she's an anthropologist, and I don't believe that forensic anthropologist would be inappropriate. I don't know of her board certification in forensic anthropology.
But you were aware that she was assisting the La Plata County Sheriff's Office in identifying human remains versus animal remains.
Correct, and that is certainly appropriate. Anthropologists are well-versed in osteology, and they can provide valuable needed assistance in death investigations.
I believe I interrupted you. You were about to share with the jury your reaction when you first spoke with Jan Smith, and I'd like you to share it with them.
So I just expressed that I was disappointed that she did not have custody of the case and make it a case per se. I'd learned that the Bones, in a desire, obviously well-intentioned, to obtain the identity, were sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and a portion of some of the bones, the femur, was crushed to obtain DNA, and that my understanding is that it was prior to any official documentation of that portion of the bone. And so if there potentially is evidence in that portion of the bone, it would have been lost.
So that was your understanding at the time, and the jury's already heard about photographs and examinations that were conducted. And then in September of 2013, did you have an opportunity to look at the remains, the postcranial remains of Dylan Redwine?
I did. That was, I believe, the first time that I saw the remains, and I think that was up at the college. And Dr. Mulhern was there, and I believe that Tom Kelling was there also. And so that was the first time that I had looked at the bones.
And was Jan Smith there as well?
Yeah, actually, I think she was, although I don't recall that with certainty.
And the bones you looked at included the left femur, right clavicle, right tibia, and toes from the left and right hip.
Correct, and scapula too, right scapula.
And the right scapula.
Yep, so shoulder blade on the right, collarbone or clavicle on the right, right and left thigh bones, right lower leg bone, and a couple of little small bones from the toes.
From the left and right foot.
Correct.
And based on the bones that were examined at that point, and that was September of 2013, were you able to make a determination as to the cause and manner of Dylan Redwine's death at that time, Dr. Kurtzman?
No. The bones had evidence of postmortem predation. I did not recognize any specific pattern of injury on the bones that would be indicative of a injury that might have been sustained during life.
And I'm going to fast forward then, if we could, to November of 2017. Did you then become involved in this case again?
I did. So by that time, I had relocated to Montana in November of 2015, and I was notified by the office that there was a desire for a forensic pathologist to look at the case. And so at that point in time, I asked if I was going to be involved in the case, that I wanted to see the information just as it might have been received had Jan called me from day one. And when I say Jan, the coroner, Jan Smith, back when the bones were originally found. So I had a chance to take a look at the bones and the cranium that had been discovered. And I looked at the bones at the Forensic Investigation Research Station in Grand Junction.
And to be clear, you'd been asked to render an expert opinion as to the cause and manner of Dylan Redwine's death.
That is correct.
And you were going to look at the cranium and the bones, I believe you said?
That is correct.
What other information did you review as part of your analysis in order to determine cause and manner of death?
So there was a historical timeline which had been presented by Lieutenant Jim Mizell with the La Plata County Sheriff's Office. And there was a map which showed the location of Mark Redwine's home, the location of the remains when they were first discovered, and then the additional remains, or the cranium basically, discovered about a year, about 2 years after the original remains were first discovered. Let's see. Actually, if I can refer to my records.
I was going to ask, if it would refresh your recollection, I'll ask the court to grant you permission to look at them. You just need to let us know what you're looking at.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you. This is a letter that I had authored, which is dated March 3rd, 2018, which is to Jim Mizell. and I have a listing of the items that were reviewed. And it,
Doctor, can I stop you for a second? Will the court allow him to read from the list, or would you prefer he refresh his recollection, Your Honor, and go line by line?
do you care?
I'm going to ask him some questions about these sources, so I'd rather have it all out there as accurately as possible.
All right, so reading's fine.
And can I just look at, I know I got the document, I just want to look at it and make sure I got the right copy.
That's fine, come on up.
No objection to reading sources review.
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Thank you. Forensic anthropology report and photographs prepared by Dr. France, forensic anthropologist. That was dated December 15th, 2015. A map depicting Middle Mountain Road with locations and distance deemed pertinent to the death investigation. The La Plata County, Colorado grand jury indictment. The probable cause affidavit in the matter of extradition of Mark A. Redwine. Timeline of electronic devices, which is listed as S12 19697. Work product, Dylan Redwine, also dated same number, authored by Jim Mazzell and Lieutenant Tanya Goldbrick. Schematic drawings of the first floor Redwine home. Schematic drawings of the second floor Redwine home. Photographs depicting locations of luminol and phenolphthalein positive testing for blood. Photographs of a white Dodge pickup truck. A composite chart including skeletal diagram, scene photographs, and personal effect photographs. And then email communication from me dated October the 11th, from you, meaning Jim Mazzell, with the subject line Redwine.
What was your reaction, Dr. Kurtzman, to seeing that Dr. Diane France, had been consulted as a forensic anthropologist and rendered an opinion on this case, as well as having produced a report that you reviewed?
I thought that was good. Dr. France is a well-known forensic anthropologist. She's a board-certified forensic pathologist. She's practiced many years. I've worked with Diane a number of occasions over the years.
Respectfully, I think at this point the answer starts to become cumulative and bolstering. He's already answered this was a good thing. It's evident he respects her opinion. I think anything beyond that, like I said, bolstering and cumulative.
You care? You want any more of this?
No, Your Honor, I could round it up with one more question.
All right, go ahead.
Were you pleased to see that that kind of review had been conducted in this case as you set out to do your job?
Yes.
Thank you. Based on your review of the materials you described, as well as the examination of the bones and cranium, which we're about to get into, what did you determine to be the cause and manner of death of Dylan Redwine?
So with regard to the cause of death, I can't honestly say I would know the cause of death. All the organs are gone, the skin is gone, all the soft tissue is absent. And so there's no way that I could say what the exact cause of death is. However, with regard to the circumstances leading up to the report of a missing 13-year-old, and my interpretation of the findings that I saw from my direct examination, the conclusion that I had was that the manner of death was homicide.
Doctor, I'd like to have you take us through the steps of your analysis leading to your conclusion, your expert opinion, that Dylan Redwine, the manner of his death was homicide.
Sure. The information that was provided to me did not provide any indication that Dylan Redwine, as a 13-year-old, as a teenager, there was no indication that he had any significant pre-existing natural disease that would have caused his death. It was reported to me that he was in good health.
And is that something, Dr. Kurtzman, you do in all cases when you're conducting an analysis to determine cause and manner of death? You look at pre-existing health conditions as part of that analysis?
Yes, it is.
And what did you learn about significance, or what did you learn of significance about the Redwine home in your analysis?
What I read from the reports was that there was blood detected in portions of the Redwine home.
And what was the significance of that to you? Why did that matter?
So I would basically take that at face value. That would be something that is derived by the investigation of individuals who have expertise in crime scene analysis, and it would be reported that they have found blood. And typically, blood means that a person has sustained some sort of an injury or some sort of a pathologic process that has caused bleeding. And so if you have blood from an individual that is deposited on a surface, more often than not, it'll be associated with some form of trauma.
Did you learn that one of those surfaces was a floor that was actually covered by a rug?
Bleeding, and to a certain extent, and I know experts can rely on hearsay in informing their opinions, but at a certain point, the hearsay starts to eclipse the analysis and the opinion.
Well, on the hearsay, I disagree. It's clear under Rule 703 that it's admissible in order for the jury to understand and weigh the opinion that this expert is giving. In terms of the bleeding, I think it's okay at some point. I'll make you stop, I guess. So if you keep objecting, that's fine. But I understand you're trying to get into something specific.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Do you need me to repeat the question, or do you recall the question?
Just for accuracy, let's repeat it, please.
Okay. Did you learn that on at least one of the surfaces where blood was detected, it was a floor covered by a rug?
Yes, I did.
And what was the significance of that to you as you looked to determine cause and manner of death for Dylan Redwine?
That there was blood that was concealed.
And what about the map of Middle Mountain Road that you described just a few moments ago? And I should also ask, have you also had an opportunity to visit Middle Mountain Road yourself?
Yes, so I actually had an opportunity to visit the area yesterday when I arrived here in town. And I went up with the investigator. We saw the home of Mark Redwine. And then we drove from the home up Middle Mountain Road to the site of the bones that were recovered initially. And after we arrived at that site, we walked down the slope to see more closely where those bones were recovered. And it had been reported to me, so I had a general understanding of the terrain and the vegetation that was present, but this actually gave me a chance to see it firsthand for myself. Then we departed from that location and we drove to a ridge overlooking where the cranium was discovered.
Your Honor, at this point, I'm going to respectfully ask to approach and object to further narrative about what happened yesterday. I have a discussion I want to have with the district attorney and Your Honor at the bench.
All right.
Thank you. Dr. Kurtzman, at the time you authored your report in this case, you'd also looked at the map, the Middle Mountain, am I right?
Yes, I had.
And at the time you authored your report, what was the significance, if any, of looking at the map and the locations depicted on the map?
Just for orientation, a clear depiction of the circumstances that are reported, gaining an understanding of the location as a mountainous region, the location of the decedent's home, where Dylan was reportedly last known alive, where the bones were recovered, and then ultimately where the cranium was discovered.
I believe you also testified you had an opportunity to look at the timeline of electronic devices. Is that right?
That is correct.
What was the significance of that, if any, in forming your expert opinion?
So the timeline included text messages that went to and were from what was reported as Dylan's phone. And those messages, at least from Dylan to others, abruptly stopped sometime shortly after, I believe, about 9 o'clock on November the 18th of 2012.
So you look at all that, and now we'll transition to your examination of the cranium, if we can.
That's correct.
Can you please tell the jury what injuries, if any, did you observe on the cranium of Dylan Redwine?
There were fractures, which I would classify as perimortem fractures, and there were defects on a part of the right side of the cranium called the zygomatic arch that to me had the appearance of an incised wound or a sharp force injury.
Can you tell the jury how you, in your work, define perimortem, please, as it relates to this case?
Sure. As a pathologist, antemortem is a term that we would use to describe things that took place during life. And when an injury is sustained during life, or with any type of a disease process, there is a response by the body. So since we're talking about bone in particular in this case, if a person sustains a bone fracture while they're alive, there are a number of different changes that take place. And the body will begin that healing process almost immediately. So there's bleeding that first takes place. There's a layer of the bone called the periosteum, which is a connective tissue layer that's on the top of the bone. There'll be bleeding in that area. And then after the bleeding takes place, then there's inflammation. And then the inflammatory process starts to break down the damaged bone. And then after the damaged bone has been broken down, then you start to see regrowth of new bone. And then as that regrowth of new bone forms, if the edges of the bone are in close approximation with each other, then will form what's called a fracture callus. And then ultimately over time, the bone will remodel, or it'll, if you will, absorb what was there, and then the bone will return to a fairly normal structure and function. And if you look at bone, you can see whether or not it has undergone a healing process. So in the bones that I looked at with regard to Dylan Redwine, there had been no healing process. So as I use the term perimortem, if somebody sustains an injury immediately before death or immediately after death, then I may not be able to recognize the difference in bone. The one caveat with bone is that if the body remains well preserved, that perimortem period can extend out days, weeks, months, even years. And so if you take a look at, and part of that is based on the characteristics of bone, and I'm not sure if you want me to describe that now.
You know what, I'll ask you to pause for a moment, and I think it might be helpful for the jury if we could use Exhibit 374, which was previously admitted. Put that on the screen. There's a pointer to your left. Oh, that's the pen, actually. Oh, down there.
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
Doctor, I'm going to ask the court's permission for you to step down and walk us through what you're describing using Exhibit 374 on the screen, please.
And Dr. Kurtzman, if you would grab the microphone out of the stand, you should just pull out. I actually stand off to the side for the jury.
Mr. Bogan, can you see?
Thanks for asking. I can see.
So what we're looking at, just for orientation purposes, is the front of the cranium. And the area that I'm pointing to, and I'm going to refer to this as the right side, even though it looks like I'm pointing to your left. So this is the right front of the cranium, over the right eye. And then what would be over the left eye is over here on the right. So just the opposite. So just for clarification purposes, I'm referring to the anatomical side of the specimen that we're looking at. So this is sort of the getting closer to the top of the head. So this would be the nose down here, left side of the head, right side of the head. You'll see this squiggly line that runs over the top, and that's what's called the coronal suture. And then there is a squiggly line that runs to the back, and that's called the sagittal suture. Right? So those are not fractures. That's a normal structure that everybody has.
Dr. Kurtzman, oh, I'm sorry. You were perhaps about to point to it, but you described observing and analyzing a perimortem skull fracture. Can you show us where that is on 374?
So this is the fracture, which I would classify as perimortem. And there's another fracture that's contiguous with the coronal suture on the left, which I would also describe as a perimortem fracture. And the skull fractures in a couple of different ways. You take a look at the skull, you may have a simple linear fracture, or you may have a depressed skull fracture. So somebody who's struck, let's say, with a hammer, or with a pipe, or with a baseball bat. Sometimes you may see a portion of bone which is actually depressed. The linear fracture, I would classify this as a linear fracture, is irregular. And basically my interpretation of this would be a perimortem fracture as opposed to a postmortem fracture or let's say a fracture that has occurred long after death, long after the tissue is absent, and the bone has dried and desiccated.
How would it look to the jury if this was actually a postmortem fracture as opposed to perimortem skull fracture?
So postmortem fractures tend to be much more linear. Think of it if you had a, let's say, a ceramic pot or plate, and if you were to drop that, then the lines that you would see are typically not crooked or winding. They're typically very straight. And then there may be tiny little chips that break off away from that. And that's because ceramic is very brittle. And if you take a look at the bone, in a post-mortem state, where the tissue is no longer present, the moisture has been lost, then what happens is that the bone has more of a characteristic like ceramic as opposed to bone during the living state or the immediate perimortem state. So bone, when you take a look at it, in the living state or in the time period right around the time of death, is actually very elastic. Bone can bend. And that's actually how our bone functions and constantly remodels during life. Is because bone is made up of connective tissue, collagen, and that collagen is where the hydroxyapatite is deposited. Hydroxyapatite is calcium, mostly calcium and phosphorus. There's obviously some other minerals, and it's that calcium and phosphorus, that mineral content, that really gives it the really kind of the hard structure. So in the post-mortem state, that's desiccated, all the moisture is lost. Sometimes that collagen is degraded, and you're left with just the mineral component. And so that's very, very brittle. It's not very elastic. And when it breaks, it typically breaks in a straight line and where it may have chips.
So you concluded that this was a perimortem skull fracture based on that?
Correct.
And what is a perimortem skull fracture of this nature consistent with, in your expert opinion?
So this can be associated with blunt force injury. So when I say blunt force injury, I'm talking about something that strikes the skull, or perhaps where the skull comes in contact with something else that's not moving, or some combination of the two. The other part about this cranium is that most of the face is absent. And so it could be because of one of two things, or perhaps a combination of both. It could be because of post-mortem predation. If you take a look at remains that are discovered in an outdoor setting, animals oftentimes have access and they will consume portions of the skeleton. And we would call that post-mortem predation. The other possibility is that perhaps it was trauma-related. There's a type of fracture called a Laporte fracture, where the face, if you will, becomes dislocated from the rest of the cranium. So there's a couple of different Laporte fractures. Laporte fracture 1, which is just where the maxilla, think of where you have your upper teeth. Imagine if you were to just knock off that segment that contained your upper teeth. That would be a Laporte fracture 1. A Laporte fracture 2 is a fracture that goes up through the maxilla. The maxilla forms your upper part of your jaw. If that fracture crosses through up into the nose and the base of the organs, that would be considered a Laporte fracture 2. And a Laporte fracture 3 is where it crosses through the maxilla, but also includes the zygoma and across the top of the nasal bone, where your actual face, if you will, dislocated from the rest of the cranium. So if Dylan had sustained a Laporte fracture...
Your Honor, this part of the question, respectfully, is speculative. If Dylan had received, I don't believe that's flowing from any information or evidence before the jury or evidence before the expert, but now he's just positing speculation.
Yeah, he's an expert. He can give different reasons why the rest of Dylan's space wasn't there. He's not saying that's what happened. It's just a possibility. I don't see a problem with it. Go ahead.
Go ahead, doctor, please.
Thank you. And so as Mr. Bogan was pointing out, I don't know that happened. All I'm trying to account for is why that bone might be missing. And so it could be traumatic related, or it could be postmortem predation. I don't know. It's not available for me to look at, so I can't say with certainty.
And for the part of Dylan's skull, the cranium, that you were able to look at, you were able to conclude, in your expert opinion, it's perimortem skull fracture consistent with blunt force injury.
Asked and answered, leading.
You can answer the question.
Yes.
So, doctor, we're going to turn to number 377 on the screen. If you could just briefly take us through this and what significance it had in your determination as to the cause and manner of Dylan Redwine's death.
So this is a photograph that shows the left side of the cranium, and the front of the head is on the left side of the picture. The back of the head is on the right side of the picture, and what we can see is the coronal suture. We can see part of the sagittal suture, lambdoidal suture, and on the left side, contiguous with the coronal suture, there's a gap. And so that would be classified as a diastatic fracture. So simple fractures, depressed fractures, and diastatic fractures. Diastatic fracture is basically an area where the fracture extends through and it widens the sutures that are already present.
And this is a different part of the cranium than you were looking at in the previous exhibit, am I right? Different
Correct.
angle, different fracture?
Correct. So the fracture, the linear fracture that we saw on the left frontal area would be just out of sight from this side.
We're going to turn to 379, doctor. What is the jury looking at in Exhibit 379 that was noteworthy for you?
On 379, this is the coronal suture, and you can see the fracture that extends from that point.
Going to turn to 382. What do we see here, Dr. Kurtzman?
So this photograph depicts the inner table of the bone. So this is the fracture, the right frontal fracture, left frontal fracture, from the inside. And it also shows some of the normal anatomy that we would see on the interior of the cranium.
Thank you. You can have a seat, Doctor.
Can I have 30 seconds with counsel real quick?
Sure. Thank you, Judge.
Doctor, I'd like to talk to you just briefly about head injuries in your experience as a forensic pathologist and in determining cause and manner of death. Can you tell the jury, please, when you see a skull fracture consistent with the ones that you've described here, what kind of blood would you expect to see or not?
If it is a closed head injury without any defect to the skin, you may not see any blood. If it is a head injury that causes a laceration, then the skin is disrupted, and the skin of the scalp is quite vascular, and it will bleed pretty vigorously. And so from the standpoint of bleeding outside of the body, again, you need to have a defect in the skin for that to happen. But you don't always have to have a skin defect to sustain head injury. So if a person sustains a bruise on the scalp without breaking the skin, then that blood is contained. If we take a look a little bit deeper, if you have blood that accumulates under the periosteum, it would be called a cephalohematoma. Usually not something you would see in a 13-year-old. It's more commonly seen in infants and as a complication of childbirth or birth process. Then if we go a little bit deeper, the next layer would be what's called a epidural hematoma. And so in an epidural hematoma, what happens is usually there's a fracture which crosses one of the blood vessels that lines the inside of the skull. And when that fracture crosses the blood vessel lining the inside of the skull, it'll cause bleeding, and the bleeding will accumulate between the skull and what's called the dura mater, or the dura. I'll just say dura, D-U-R-A, just for simplification. And it will form a contained hematoma, or blood space. And so when it does that, it's a space-occupying mass within the cranium, and therefore it can have life-threatening consequences if it's not treated properly. If a person has blunt force injury sustained and it causes the brain to move relative to the cranium, then it can cause what's called a subdural hematoma. And so just for description purposes, I'm holding up my right hand and I'm holding it in the shape of a fist. And we'll just imagine that that's the brain. And then I'm taking my left hand and I'm forming kind of a C shape around my right fist. And so if something strikes the head and accelerates the head, sorry about that. If something strikes the head and accelerates the head very quickly, the cranium will move, but the brain may not immediately. Think of it this way. If you're in a motor vehicle that's traveling, if you're not seatbelted in place, and you're traveling at the same velocity as the car, and if the car stops abruptly, you as a passenger will continue to move at the same velocity. And so you would go through the windshield, or you'd go through the window, or whatever else. Same thing happens with the head. So if something strikes the head really fast, or if somebody falls and the head stops really quickly, the brain is going to continue to move. And when it does move, it will tear small blood vessels that span between the surface of the brain and the dura. And when that happens, those small vessels can tear, and when they tear away, they will leak, and that will cause a subdural hematoma. Subdural because it's below the dura. If there's sufficient force and the brain comes in contact with the bone, either again with a fall or a blow with a hard object, sometimes that force will be transmitted and it will directly damage the surface of the brain, and we would call that a cerebral contusion, basically a brain bruise. And then the other thing that can happen, depending on how much movement is involved with the head, and if there's a rotational component, the brain can move around and can produce shearing injuries. And so we would call those gliding or intermediary contusions or diffuse axonal injury. So there's a broad spectrum of injuries that can occur. Some of them can be rapidly fatal. Some of them are injuries that can be survived. They may or they may not be associated with blood that's lost externally.
And is it possible for a blunt force injury that causes a skull fracture to result in someone's demise?
Absolutely. It's common.
And to be clear, doctor, during your examination, did you also see evidence of post-mortem predation?
Yes, I did.
So I'd like to put 377 back on the screen. Did you, or actually, I'm going to go to 379. As you looked at the skull, and I can refer you to 377 or 379, what examples could you provide to the jury of post-mortem predation? Excuse me.
So postmortem predation usually is seen as linear scores or marks on the bone, and can be produced by a variety of animals. And animals will gnaw on bone, chew on bone. And in this photograph, you can see on the surface of the bone, I'll say linear striations. And then there's some linear striations here as well. That would be pretty typical for postmortem predation.
How about on 377?
Same thing here. Let's take a look. We can see some linear markings, pretty common for gnawing on bone or chewing on bone. And it looks like some at the top and on the side here. But this type of projection is a little bit more difficult to see.
But you did see some during your examination.
Yes, no question.
And 382, and I think I misspoke, and I appreciate counsel flagging that for me. This is the inner view of where that skull fracture was. Did you see any evidence of animals gnawing on the remains after post-mortem, after Dylan Redwine's death?
So earlier today we were looking at what looked like a tooth puncture. It's not represented in this particular photograph. This does show fracture line, and you're also looking at vascular sulcites or sulcites basically. So these are basically tracks from the middle meningeal artery.
So you looked at the photographs that you also looked at as part of your analysis, and you were able to see what you saw back then, which some evidence of postmortem predation, but also the skull fractures that you described to the jury,
That's correct.
which were perimortem.
Correct.
Doctor, you mentioned that you also identified and analyzed sharp force injuries. Is that right?
Correct. Do you want me to sit or continue?
If you'd like to have a seat, I'm going to ask you to stand up in just a minute or two, but you can have a seat.
I'll stay here.
Where did you see the sharp force injuries on the cranium of Dylan Redwine, Dr. Kurtzman?
They were present on a bone called the zygomatic arch, and it's on the right side.
I'm going to put 370 up back on the screen. It's 370 previously. What are we looking at in 370, Dr. Kurtzman?
We are looking at the right side of the cranium. And this hole that you see here is the external, well, what would be the external auditory canal. And so if you were to put your finger in your ear, if you put your pinky in your ear, probably she can't go quite deep enough. Wind up in that hole. So your ear is right around, this is the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch, and that's sort of your high cheekbone here. So it's running from back to front. So if you put your finger right in front of your ear and feel that ridge, that'll go right to your cheekbone. That's the zygomatic arch.
We go to 372, Doctor. What does the jury see in 372?
So what you're seeing here are two linear defects in the zygomatic arch. And so if you take a look at this defect, there's one surface.
I'll get it. Okay. He can move if he needs to. Feel free to.
You can see one surface on the left. You can see another surface on the right, and they are parallel to each other. There's another defect just below or anterior to that. And it too has a surface that's linear on the back side, linear on the front side, and they are both parallel to each other. If you look at these from a different angle, you can see that these are wedge-shaped defects that come to an acute apex or a walk, or actually not a line, a D, excuse me. And that is a typical characteristic that you would see with knife marks on soft tissue and or both. One of the important characteristics for me in this particular case is that there's a piece of bone which is lifted up. And with a perimortem injury, because the bone is still flexible, or plastic, if you will, it can bend, if you will, as it's being cut. In contrast to something that is hard and brittle, where it would likely chip off. And so to me, my interpretation of this is a perimortem injury that is typical of an incised or cut wound, as opposed to a stab. A stab wound, typically on the surface, is shorter than it is deep. So if I were to take, if I were to stab myself with this pointer, it would create a defect as wide as the pointer, but it could be, as long as the pointer is. So that would be a stab wound. An incised wound is a little bit different because the length of the wound on the surface is greater than the depth of the wound. So we have two parallel surfaces. We have a tangent injury. So this is oriented, if you take a look at the force that's applied, it is applied tangential to the skin surface. And so not directly, but rather tangential. So it is undermining the bone. And so in comparison to, let's say, postmortem predation, If you take a look at rodents, rodents have teeth that are like chisels. Think of a beaver. Not that a beaver would do anything, but just for purposes that you could, I think most people are familiar with beavers' teeth, like chisels. If you take a look at a mountain lion, or if you take a look at a coyote, they have canine come to a point, although they're not a sharp apex point, slightly rounded at the surface. And if something is biting bone, more typically it would be a direct contact with bone, perpendicular. Not to say that it can't be gnawing at an angle, but it would be very difficult, in my opinion, not possible to create that pattern with a tooth. So I believe that it's consistent with a sharp portion.
And is that true for both of those marks there that are reflected by the yellow arrows, Dr. Kurtzman?
That is correct.
Your Honor, I'd like to approach with what's been previously marked as 389 and 390 for identification and provided to counsel.
All right.
If I may.
Go ahead.
Dr. Kurtzman, did you also take photographs yourself when conducting the examination and analysis at the laboratory?
Yes, I did.
And did you take photos of the cut marks, the sharp force injuries you just talked about? And are those reflected in 389 and 390 that you're looking at?
Yes, they are.
And do those photographs fairly and accurately depict how those marks looked when you examined them in November of 2017?
Yes, they do.
Your Honor, at this time, people move 389 and 390 into evidence, please.
Mr. Bogan?
No objection.
They're admitted.
And I'm going to put 389 on the screen, but Your Honor, this actually might be a good time to stop if the court wishes to take the afternoon break.
Why don't we do that? Let's start up again at 10 after 3. Everybody remember my admonitions not to talk to each other or anybody else about the case. And everybody stand for the jury, please. Right, we'll be in recess.
Thank you, Your Honor.